tout le monde. Merci beaucoup. Excusez-moi que je parle en anglais. So I try to talk in a clear way. So thank you very much for this honor of being part of this 10-year celebration of this work in France, and very important. I was tweeting when I came into this wonderful room back to Australia, sending a tweet saying, here we are in the Académie de Médecins in Paris, and we are part of a global effort and an international effort to provide better care to people with psychosis and schizophrenia. And this is a very, very important work that we are doing. So it's a real privilege to be here, and thank you again for the invitation. So I try to give you an idea of the past and the future. That's my job, I think, isn't it? So since I'm rapidly becoming part of the past. So this is one of the landmark events that happened in the mid-1990s, and you can see that many people from around the world came together to found something which was an international network of people trying to shift the focus from chronic schizophrenia into the early stages of illness, early psychosis. We came up with a new term, with more inclusive term, early psychosis. And we set up a thing called the International Early Psychosis Association, and you can see that many of the people already doing first episode work were at that meeting, and that has continued, been a very important organisation over the years. The most recent meeting, some of you I know were in Milan in October for the 10th meeting, and you can see that we have now broadened the focus, not just for psychotic illnesses, but across the spectrum of potentially serious mental illnesses, particularly in young people, but not just in young people. And so this is the development. So these have been 10 of these meetings now. So you can see it has momentum, but it hasn't got enough momentum. So we want to see this everywhere. That's the goal, and in all parts of France too. So, just quickly, what have we learned in 20 years? I'll just try to give you the headlines, because as you can imagine, with 20 years of international effort, there are hundreds or thousands of pieces of research in this area now. So what are the main things? What are the main things that we have learned? The first thing, and we have to thank our Norwegian colleagues for producing the best evidence for this, from the TIPS project, we know that treatment delay is very important. So it's just unbelievable that people with serious mental illnesses like psychosis can wait a year or two before they get treated. This doesn't happen in cancer. It doesn't happen. If you have a breast lump or if you have a skin lesion, it can be, hours or days before you get actually diagnosed and treated. That's not the case. It's still not the case with so this is one very important focus. And they showed that if you do reduce the delay in treatment from maybe a year or two down to a few weeks, the outcomes are better. Even 10 years later, the outcomes are better. They're twice as good in terms of recovery rates. They're still not good enough, because you still have to treat the patient properly. You have to have a service that treats the patient very well and consistently over time. And very few countries do that. Almost no country will, diagnose the person early, treat them intensively in the first few years, and then keep looking after them if they need it in the long term. Hardly anyone does that. But they do that routinely in cancer and heart disease. That's just normal in rich countries. And it's not normal yet in mental illness. That is a disgrace. It's an international disgrace. And we have to change that. So that's one important thing. The next thing, which is Marie-Odil's focus, and she's done a wonderful job here in Paris, setting up the clinic here. I've been here several times, and it's very sophisticated. But this area is very important. We didn't imagine we could do this, and Anita's going to talk later on about her work, but she was part of that, mapping the early stages of how people become psychotic. And if you just look at that data, you could see that people are sick for quite a long time before they become psychotic. 70% of them have problems which you can't really specifically recognize, but they have a problem. And so we now know we can predict reasonably well the risk of becoming psychotic, and also we can reduce the risk of becoming psychotic. We can delay the onset of psychosis. Even though we can't cure patients, there's no cure in that sense, but we can reduce the progression, and we can modify the course, which is a big thing. That's all we can do with diabetes, but we treat diabetes quite effectively now too, but we're not curing it. We're helping people avoid the complications, and we're giving them good lives. That's what we can already do here too. And we can predict about a 36% chance of becoming psychotic from this meta-analysis over the first 3 years of just with clinical signs, really, clinical features. That's enough, but maybe we could improve on that with biomarkers and other sort of predictors. And this is a paper. There are many of these papers, but this one was just published late last year from one of our collaborators in Australia using the data from our service, and it showed that if you put together a number of variables in a sequential way, you can predict very accurately who is going to become psychotic, maybe 80% accuracy. So that's pretty good. That's almost the same as already having the illness. You could confidently treat people at that point, you would think. On the other hand, even though we're trying to zero in on psychosis, and the risk is 36% of becoming psychotic, there's probably a higher risk of having other kinds of problems, like mood and anxiety problems. So the patients are not, if they don't become psychotic, they're not okay. They still have a risk of other syndromes and other problems, particularly depression, anxiety, and maybe some substance abuse as well. So they need help. They don't necessarily need antipsychotics or psychotic treatment, but they need help. They need mental health care, many of these patients. So this is a clue to what we should do. We have to broaden our focus beyond psychosis and try to diagnose and treat a spectrum of emerging mental disorders, particularly in young people. That is the way we have to go. We can't isolate ourselves into diagnostic prisons, in a way, you know, of schizophrenia and bipolar and so on, because they don't work that well for the early stages of illness. I'll come back to that. Anyway, sticking with psychosis for a minute, there are at least 11 or 12 randomized controlled trials now showing through this meta-analysis that we can reduce the risk of progression to psychosis by 50% in the first year or two after we recognize this at-risk mental state. And that's not bad. I mean, you're not curing it, but if you help the person, mainly with psychosocial treatments, that's quite a positive thing. Now, it hasn't as been impactful. That's level 1 Cochrane evidence we're looking at there. That's level 1. That's the best evidence we can have of value of a treatment. But that hasn't been influential in transforming services yet, which is interesting. Why not? This is one of the trials that we did. Paul Amminger led this. It was done in Vienna. It was very effective influence of omega-3 fatty acids on risk. And even that reduction of risk lasted for seven years after the 3-month trial. So the risk was reduced for 7 years. That was almost too good to be true, you know? Even though it was a well-conducted trial, you have to replicate things. And when we did try to replicate it, unfortunately, we couldn't produce the same results. This was a big multi-center trial that Anita and others were part of. And we think the reason we couldn't replicate the effect of the fish oil or the omega-3 in this bigger trial was because we were providing pretty good psychosocial care to all the patients. So the actual transition rate was only 5 or 10% for everybody in both groups. So in a way we shot ourselves in the foot by not actually testing the actual intervention clearly enough. But in a way we have to help the patients in a broad way in these studies, ethically, we think. So that's where that piece of research is at. So what we're doing now, we have funding from the National Institute of Mental Health in Washington, and we're doing what's called an adaptive trial, where we modify the treatment according to how the patient actually progresses in the trial. So you see that they come into the trial and they get simple psychological interventions first, And then after 4 to 6 weeks, if they're not improved, they get randomized to more intensive psychological treatments, cognitive behavioral case management, or just continuing with the simple. Then we test the effect of antidepressants as a neuroprotective sort of strategy as the next step. And then finally, if they're still not in remission by, say, 9 months or so into the trial, they receive a choice of fish oil or low-dose antipsychotics. So in a way, that mirrors what clinicians would probably be doing, you know, in real life, and it's testing it in a more randomized way. So we expect that most of these patients will benefit and get a remission as a result of this sort of set of strategies, but that's what we're testing now. And there could be experimental treatments looked at too, like anti-inflammatories and other sorts of biotherapies. Okay. I'm going pretty fast because I'm just trying to capture the main points of what we've learned, and maybe it's not all up to date. There's new material appearing all the time. So the next thing is the first episode, and we know now that we can improve the outcomes for first episode psychosis during this critical period of the first couple of years or so after diagnosis. And Marietta Nordentoft in Copenhagen did this systematic review a couple of years ago and showed that this was the case for the first 2 years. The outcomes are definitely better if you're provided with a specialist first episode program. Now, the problem is that if you discharge the patients to standard chronic services at that point, some of the gains will be lost if you look at the patients at 5 years. I think Vidya is going to be speaking about that later. She's got some great research from Canada about that. A more larger systematic review or meta-analysis was carried out by Christophe Correll. I don't think this is published yet. This was presented at the SIRS meeting last year, but I haven't seen it published. But it's in 9 studies, 9 RCTs of first episode treatment, and basically showing benefits across the board for these more specialized programs, which they call CSC in the US. And these programs were the subject of the RAISE trial in the US, which was published a year or 2 ago now. Now, it took the Americans a long time to catch up with Europe and the rest of the world on this, but they finally did a really good trial comparing more specialized care with standard care. Now, their specialized care was not as good as what you see in European-style programs, but it was still good enough to show that at 2 years there were significant benefits for the patients. But only if the DUP, only if the duration of untreated psychosis was less than 74 weeks, which is already incredibly long. But if the DUP, which in America is very long, if it's beyond 74 weeks, then more specialized intervention doesn't work. So this is a very important point. You have to, if you want to help the patient to recover, you have to not only provide comprehensive specialized care with many different components, but you also have to do it early enough in the illness. You can't wait until the person's life is in ruins before you start treating them. It's very hard to rebuild that building for the 21-year-old who has been sitting in their bedroom for 3 years, no friends, and with very serious symptoms. It can be done, probably, but it's very, very hard. Much easier if you see the patient very early in that episode. So that's very important, and it led to expansion of these services, which I'll show you a bit now. So thanks to Bob Heinsohn, who's been the real driving force in the NIMH around this, and in the US, we've seen a very rapid increase in early psychosis programs in America. Originally, there were very few. I think in the state of Oregon, that was the only state that really had early psychosis services going back 10 years or so. Then in 2014, we saw more programs being funded. 2014-15, even more, and it's projected that we will have many of these clinics. Now, these are quite small initiatives still. So, and we don't know what the advent of Donald Trump is going to do to this, unfortunately. We don't know what he's going to do to mental health care, and probably not good things. In Australia, we finally, after a long period, began to get investment in early psychosis services too. It took 20 years before we got investments, and so we now have 6 centres in major capital cities in Australia. And I could show you maps of Denmark and the UK, which show the same phenomenon, of Canada as well. Canada has been a very important country for rolling out early psychosis services. So it is something that's happening, but it should be happening a lot faster and in many more places. And it's great that David is here, because he's going to tell you a lot more about this subject, which is early intervention in psychosis saves not just money, but a lot of money. And he'll show you the facts on that. And there's this term mental wealth, which I think came from the UK originally, but our Prime Minister in Australia uses it all the time now. He loves saying the words mental wealth. And what it means is that if you invest in healthcare in mental illness, because of the timing in the life cycle, there's a big return on investment. It's different from investing in 85-year-olds with cancer, or 75-year-olds who have a stroke. Now, you've got to treat those people, but you don't make a profit out of it. Whereas if you treat people with mental illness in the prime of life, you will actually get the return on investment, and I hope David will be able to give you some more. So there's some of the papers there. So this was in the Huffington Post in the US about a year or two ago. And if you read the subtitle, it says "Stop the Madness," and it sounds like there's a new drug being developed to cure psychosis. But what the whole article is about is early intervention services for people with emerging mental illness. And so they describe what's actually happened in the wake of the RAISE trial, and they try to say, look, we can stop the madness. We can actually have an impact on this, which wasn't thought about in that way, especially in America. There's such tremendous pessimism about the treatment of schizophrenia and psychosis. Because they treated it so badly, it looked really bad. It looked like it was untreatable. Okay, so where is this field going? I guess you'll hear about that from many other people here today, but one of the things, and there's a meeting in the Netherlands later in the year about this, is that how do we use the drugs? We haven't been using the medications in a very sophisticated way. We've thought, we start treating them and we keep everyone on medication, and usually they get too much medication, especially if they're not getting better. They attract more and more different kinds of medications. But if we treat them in a more sophisticated way, maybe we could get different results. So this is a study from Lex Wondrink and colleagues, which is a great name, but he's in the Netherlands, and he did this study, which, along with colleagues, which showed that in patients who have a really good remission from a first episode, and that's about 50% of patients will have a really good remission from a first episode, what do? The patients will say to you, can I stop the medication now? I'm better. And we always say, no, not yet. Let's just be careful. And because we're worried about relapses and so on, and there is a risk of relapse, obviously. These are relapsing illnesses, even for the people that actually have a good remission. And most of the research up to date was if you did actually reduce or stop the medication, the patients did have a high rate of relapse. And this study showed the same thing in a way, that if you randomise patients to discontinuing the medication or continuing it at the same dose, that you did get more relapses in the first 2 years. They weren't serious relapses, but you still got a return of the symptoms. But when they followed these patients up at 7 years, the patients had no difference in the relapse rates, actually. And the patients who had the low-dose medication, they didn't mostly come off the medication totally, but they had very, very small doses. Those patients were functioning twice as well as the patients that were on the standard maintenance doses. So the medication too much medication inhibited the social recovery of the patient. So getting the dose right for the patient, and the smallest possible dose, this study suggested, was very, very important. Now, there are replications of this study being done in Australia now and in Denmark. So we will get a better idea of the value of this. The next thing is vocational recovery. Now, not just providing psychotherapy and drugs to patients, but we need to provide vocational and social interventions, and then we get amazing recovery rates from patients. Like 80% of patients will actually get back to school or work in the first episode if you do this. And without that, it's only 50%. So this is an extremely important, and it's not rocket science. It's something that's not that hard to do if you get the right people doing it. And physical health. We know that these patients come into care at the age of 18 or 21 or 25, and they're physically healthy. They're not overweight, they have normal metabolism, but you look at them 20 years later and they're in a terrible state. That they have reduced life expectancy by 15 years, and it's all or largely due to, not all because of suicide, but largely due to physical health problems. We could prevent that if we provide preventive physical health care to these patients from the beginning. And that is not done. For some reason, psychiatrists have forgotten that they're doctors, that they don't think about the physical health of the patients. They don't want to touch the patient. They don't want to measure their waist circumference or take their blood pressure. None of those things, At least in Australia, maybe not in France. Maybe you are still doctors here. Okay. Now, the other thing is the new technologies. How can we augment and improve the treatment by adding in internet-based and mobile sort of technologies to strengthen our treatment, not to replace face-to-face contact, but to strengthen it. And that is a very promising area which Mario Alvarez and other colleagues in Melbourne are working on. Okay, now, that's psychosis. I think we are at a bit of a crossroads now in early intervention. And so we have a choice. And this is a cartoon from the main Melbourne newspaper. It says, "The life you lead, the life you could have led." So you have a choice in what you do. And we have a choice as a field. And should we, this is an article I wrote in the Australian Journal recently about this, should we try to broaden early intervention for psychosis across the whole lifespan? So we pick up the 20% of late onset cases and make early psychosis the main thing we're trying to do? Or should we go with the youth focus and try to capture more disorders and maybe have a cut-off at 25 or 30? That's a choice. I don't know what the answer is to that. You might do it one way in one country and another way in another country, but this is a debate we could actually have. One of the problems with just focusing on psychosis is that we do have this reducing transition rate for the ultra-high risk concept, and we still have a problem in accessing all of the ultra-high risk patients when most of the people that we see with the first episode have not come through the prodromal clinic or the ultra-high risk clinic. That's a problem. And then, as I showed you, even when you have the ultra-high risk group, many of them will develop other disorders as well. So it looks a bit too narrow to me to actually just go for that on its own. Not saying we shouldn't keep doing that, but maybe we have to do other things too. And then, if we focus on first episode the way we're currently doing it, we might be missing out on a lot of later onset psychoses. Like there are maybe 20, 30, 40% of people that develop a psychosis in middle age or later life. And why shouldn't they have early intervention? That's the argument. And what we've seen as well is that even when you have early psychosis programs, it's easy for the government to kill them off. Like in the UK, even though they did a really good job at rolling them out, they started to unravel them. And that nearly happened to us last year in Australia too. So they're vulnerable. They're a little bit vulnerable, these programs. They're not quite big enough. They're not quite strong enough as a paradigm to survive, the politics of mental health. And we also have critics within our own ranks about all of this, which you're probably aware of. So it's a proof of concept thing, I think. And it's necessary, but not sufficient to survive, I think. But that's just my opinion. But if we do go into extending early intervention, how should we do it? And we think that we need new models. We need new cultures of care. We can't be using the 19th century thinking and the old facilities and the traditional, environments of psychiatry. It won't work. People don't like going to those places. Not when they first contact you for help. They don't want to turn up at a 19th century psychiatric hospital, and they don't want to turn up in a chronic mental health clinic in the community where everybody else is 45, and you rock up there and you're 21, and you see these 45-year-olds with severe mental illness. That's not going to be the way. You're not going to engage very well with that. So, how do we make the transition? Now, Ashok and Vidya, who's going to be speaking later, and a group of us wrote this paper in Social Psychiatry, which is describing how we might evolve and how we are evolving from early psychosis. And, you know, we try to establish early intervention as a principle in psychiatry. You know, you wouldn't have to do this in cancer. You wouldn't have to start a journal about early intervention in cancer. They already know it's important. But in psychiatry, we still have a job to convince our colleagues that it's a viable thing. And this is working quite well, actually. The journal is going well. So what about diagnosis? In the US, they've come up with this new framework, which is probably good for biological research, but it's not very good for clinical care or for organising services or treatments or clinical trials. It's a work in progress. So we thought something more useful would be something that's very compatible with the RDoC idea, but it is still categorical, and it takes something from clinical medicine, which is the idea of staging. And, you know, we could do that within psychosis. We could go from, you know, early stages and more enriched stages of illness. You could do it within the spectrum of psychosis, like Jim Van Os has looked at there. But if you can expand that idea to the whole diagnostic framework, and what you see on this slide is that people do not develop disorders in a very clear way. They start off with problems, with symptoms which don't really make sense, they don't hang together so well, but they're clearly distressed and they are functioning poorly, but they don't fit into these more traditional categories that are down the bottom there. They have a need for care a long time before they actually meet the criteria or clearly fit into a category. That's what we see. Maybe that's not so true of depression and anxiety, because they are early features of most disorders. You could say they're gateways to other problems. But anyway, we have to study it in this way, a more fluid way, and try to impose a staging framework. That's what we think. The staging framework's an advantage because you can offer the treatment in a proportional way so that you don't over-treat patients. For example, if someone comes in to see you as a doctor with a small breast lump, if it is cancer and it has not spread, the treatment of that is much more conservative and benign than if the person has metastatic widespread cancer. In that case, they get all sorts of toxic treatments to try to save their life. But if they come in early, they get a very simple and safe treatment. And that's what we are trying to model here in psychiatry. Could we do that? And we've written a lot of papers about this now. And the important concept is this sub-threshold idea. And it means you've got to study much more carefully how mental illnesses develop. And we could go back 100 years to those classic descriptions. We're probably in the right environment for this. But how do disorders actually appear? How do they develop from being healthy to being sick? And in psychiatry, you might get some early symptoms which then increase the risk of other symptoms. So you're not sleeping, you know. Some of us are jet lagged, so we're probably more irritable and a little bit more flat or anxious than we normally would be. And if that continued, maybe we'd become a bit more depressed, and then maybe we'd start to get psychotic symptoms even. You know? So hopefully not. But the sequence of these symptoms can be studied. And there are statistical techniques now to do this. Network analysis is a very useful one for that. And we just published this paper in JAMA Psychiatry. I think it's just online in the last few days, which Barnaby Nelson and Jessica Hartman did a lot of work on. And they have been looking at ways of studying this process and looking at other areas of scientific activity like oceanography and climate science. How do patterns, how do things change? How do things evolve and get worse or get more intense? So we've been thinking in very static ways about this in psychiatry. This is one way you could become psychotic or develop a disorder. A gradual change with a series of stressors building up your symptoms, and eventually you cross a line and you're mentally ill. Another way would be if you're very well and then suddenly a major stress like an earthquake or a terrorist incident somehow transforms you into a psychiatric patient or into a mental disorder. That's another way. And then, I suppose, gradually increasing symptoms, but with recovery in between, and then eventually you have a breakdown. These are kind of obvious ways, but they're probably too static. They're probably too simplistic. And another way to think about it is that with resilience, you know, at the top of the slide there, if you have a problem and it makes you a little bit more unwell, if you have resilience, you recover quite quickly. And then the resilience might get less in the second level, and then finally you lose all resilience, and there's no barrier to actually progressing to the disorder. And that's another sort of type of scenario that could actually happen. But we can't measure these things. It's very hard to measure resilience. And then, I suppose, there's a static prediction from baseline. This is what most of the research in ultra-high risk and prodrome is about. We measure baseline risk factors, and then 6 months later we check to see who's become psychotic. And we use the baseline data to predict the psychosis. But that's probably not very smart, because we could get a lot more information over time after the baseline, which would refine and update the prediction. And that's something that might work a lot better. And that's what we're trying to work on, using more modern techniques like experience sampling. So you get data on patients perhaps every week or every month, and then you can see who's actually trending in that direction. That's what clinicians do actually in real life, but we could do it more systematically in research. So this is some of the thinking about how to measure and predict how disorders actually develop. And it's leading into, I won't go through all this because we're running out of time, but there are new techniques, and also we can test therapies, different new therapies in these patients in different ways, which are likely to be transdiagnostic and likely to be more mechanism-based. Like what Philippe's doing with a NAC, you know, the antioxidants, and we did a study with taurine, which was kind of interesting, and I mentioned the fish oil, and we're also look at cannabidiol, you know, a cannabis derivative as a sort of possible treatment here too. So anyway, so I'll probably have to skip all this. This is an attempt to broaden the risk criteria beyond psychosis, called CHARMS. Yeah, so, and obviously biomarkers. I mentioned a few of them, oxidative stress, and so on, inflammation. These sorts of biomarkers can be used, hopefully, to predict patterns and risk. So the last bit, I'm rushing a little bit, but I just want to not go over time. How are we going to actually find people to study and also help in these early stages? Well, we have to revolutionize the way we provide care, and if we're going to engage the people at the right point. And so this means a focus on young people. 75% of mental disorders will appear by the age of 25. So if we're going to find these early stages of illness, we have to focus on young people. It doesn't mean we neglect the older people. We've got to look after them, but that's not early intervention mostly. That's like continuing care. And, you know, 50% of young people will reach diagnostic threshold for a disorder during this period of puberty through to the mid to late 20s. 50% of them will actually be diagnosable, even if it's a brief episode. They will need some sort of help. And currently, very few of them are getting help for these problems. And this is probably the slide that shows that. It's the incident curve of burden of disease, and you can see that the incidence of mental ill health increases dramatically at puberty and peaks in the early 20s and then starts to drop off. It doesn't mean there aren't some new cases, as you can see later in life, but that's the thing. And what you see is it's a very different picture to what you see in physical illness. In physical illness, it's in little children, you know, on the left, and it's in the over 50s. So that's why our health system looks the way it does. It's very strong on paediatrics and children's hospitals, And if you go into one of the big hospitals in Paris, you will see people over 50. You won't see many young people in the beds in that hospital. And the whole health system has been designed on that basis. And psychiatry has had to fit into that. It's been forced into a paediatric adult model which does not work for us for these reasons. So we have to change that if we're going to help the people in an early intervention sort of way. And you're already doing that in France, I discovered, which I'll come back to. So we've got this kind of mantra which we say, we want to intervene early, but the message they get as soon as they seek help is, don't bother, you know? Or the place that you're coming to treatment isn't really designed for you anyway. And what we end up with is what we say in Australia, ambulances at the bottom of the cliff. You know, so we provide treatment when people are desperate, but we haven't actually, you know, been proactive. With the result, this is 10 years ago, 25% of young people only with a need for care were getting treatment, and that was as low as 13% in young men. So young men were getting a very bad deal out of this. So we started to develop a new architecture, a new culture of care, integrated youth mental health care through enhanced primary care. So that sounds technical, but all it is strengthening the first port of call for the young people, making it youth-friendly, making it acceptable, and putting the right types of professionals in the service. So we went from the thing on the left to the thing on the right. And this is what it looks like. It's called Headspace. It's a primary care structure. And you have this in France, in a way. It's not as standardised probably, but Maison des Adolescents, it's the same age group, 12 to 25 roughly, puberty to mid-20s. And it's designed for them, it's designed by them. They have a lot of input into the way it looks and feels, the young people. Youth participation is part of it. It's not full of psychiatrists. There are some psychiatrists linked in, but it's general practitioners, allied health professionals, vocational specialists, and drug and alcohol workers. Those are the main features of it. And I probably haven't got time, have I, to show a film. This will give you a sense of what it's actually like.
Sally is 12. She gets really anxious and worried about going to school. Sally's mum doesn't know what to do anymore. Jacob is 16. He spends all night gaming to help him escape, but he's not sure that's working anymore. He argues a lot with his family and stays out all night with his mates. Dylan is 21. He's been going through a breakup. He's been feeling down for some time, and his friends are really starting to worry. Sally's mum heard about Headspace Craigieburn on TV and gave them a call. The staff at Headspace were friendly and helpful and arranged a time to meet them for a chat. Jacob discovered Headspace Craigieburn online. He wanted to talk to someone who works with and understands young people. One of Dylan's friends told him about Headspace on Facebook, so he checked them out. He wasn't sure at first, but decided to give them a go. When you arrive, you can tell us a bit about yourself and fill out a simple iPad survey. This helps us link you with the right person. That might be a counsellor, GP, drug and alcohol worker, or an education or employment specialist. Or you might choose to join a group where you can meet other young people that are in the same boat as you. With the right support and care, Headspace can help young people and their families manage the normal ups and downs of life. Headspace Craigieburn provides support to young people aged between 12 and 25 and their families. We are situated at Craigieburn Central Shopping Centre. If you're unsure how to find us, visit our website for more information, or jump on eHeadspace for online mental health support.
Sorry, the sound and the video were slightly out of sync, but you got the general idea, hopefully. Yeah. So Headspace has been around for 10 years, 11 years now. It provides services to about 100,000 young people every year, maybe about 1,000 per site. And it's around. It covers about 50 or 60% of the country. It's been growing, as you see, progressively since that time. There are papers describing it as there's an independent evaluation which describes the sort of problems that young people have, and it can be physical as well as mental health problems. It's a bit of a mix. It's holistic. It's not just mental health, but mainly mental health, you could say. It's early stage. It's capturing them at a much earlier stage than of the problem than perhaps traditional services. Now, it doesn't fix everybody, because some of the kids that come in are quite complex. And it's really a primary care model. There's a need for specialised backup as well for about a third of them. So although the group of patients tend to improve as a whole and their functioning improves, there's still another part of the building that hasn't been built. And that's the backup system around these more diagnostic streams. And that is not yet in place. And that's a problem. That's a problem for us. It had its 10th anniversary in Melbourne last October, and this is Federation Square in Melbourne. This is a young Olympic athlete who had depression and anxiety who's speaking there. We've had good support from our government, from both sides of politics actually. These are our collection of prime ministers. This is the left-wing prime ministers here on this slide, and this is the right-wing prime ministers on this slide. And this is our current Prime Minister. They don't last long in Australia these days. It's a bit like Italy. We change our Prime Ministers every few months. But currently, he's the Prime Minister, the one on the right. And that's Tom Insel, NIMH Director and now at Google. And he's talking to our Prime Minister about new technologies in mental health. So you can see there's interest from the government about new directions in mental health, which is very good for us. And this is our new Health Minister at Origin in Melbourne, and his mother had severe bipolar disorder and died in a mental hospital. So he is very committed to mental health now. So we are in a very good position now to get more, I suppose, investment and reform in mental health. His name is Greg Hunt. So this is a world thing. There's an International Association for Youth Mental Health, a declaration written by young people. In Ireland, we have 15 of these services. This is in Galway. In Denmark, there are 9 of these services. In Canada, which a video is going to tell you about, there's the Access Project, which is a major transnational project. And there are services emerging in many parts of Canada too. And of course, this is Marie-Odile here in Paris. I had this amazing discovery last November. I discovered that there were 104 of these maisons des adolescents in France, which is incredible. And I know it's a bit variable. They're different from in some ways from the way Headspace in Australia, but it's the same idea. It's the same idea. A place that young people, teenagers and young adults can actually go. And what it probably, like in Australia, it needs to be connected better to the mental health system. And Marie-Odile and I talked about this, and we have that problem too. So anyway, it's very reassuring to see that countries are coming to the same conclusions about these things. And that's because it's so obvious, actually. It's obvious what we need to do. And it's amazing we haven't done it before. But at least we're starting to do it, which is great. And that's in Europe. And so I just want to say, the next conference, there's been 3 of these conferences about youth mental health already. The next one is very close to you. It's in Ireland in September. And you will get to meet lots of young people and lots of people working in this space as well. But probably 1/3 of the delegates will be, in the age group we're talking about. So it's a very different feel. The last one was in Montreal. So I just stopped there and just want to thank all my colleagues, some of whom are in the audience, who have been part of this amazing international network for early intervention over the last 20 years, and hopefully we have another 20-year period of really amazing reform and strengthening of our field. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.